The Gospel according to Matthew, chapter 9, verses 18 to 26. While he spake these things unto them, behold, there came a certain ruler, and worshipped him, saying, My daughter is even now dead, but come and lay thy hand upon her, and she shall live. And Jesus arose and followed him, and so did his disciples. And behold, a woman which was diseased with an issue of blood 12 years came behind him and touched the hem of his garment. For she said within herself, If I may but touch his garment, I shall be whole. But Jesus turned him about, and when he saw her, he said, Daughter, be of good comfort, thy faith hath made thee whole. And the woman was made whole from that hour. And when Jesus came into the ruler's house, and saw the minstrels and the people making a noise, he said unto them, Give place, for the maid is not dead, but sleepeth. And they laughed him to scorn. But when the people were put forth, he went in, and took her by the hand, and the maid arose. And the fame hereof went abroad into all that land. There endeth our reading. Thank you, Lord. Amen. The series of events that are reported by Matthew in chapters 8 and 9 are a little bit out of sync with the same events reported in the Gospel of Mark. And perhaps this is due to different recollections of the apostles Peter and Matthew, whose input was essentially central to these two Gospels. In any case, the healings that occur in this reading from chapter 9 now fall back into sequence with the events of chapter 5 in Mark, namely the healing of the possessed man in the land of the Gadarenes, and then coming back to Capernaum, and then the two wonderful healings, one of the woman in the multitude and the other of the daughter of Jairus, the ruler of the synagogue. Now these two healings, which I described at some length in the Gospel readings from Mark, are very poignant, and they're given in quite some detail in Mark. Here in Matthew, they're given very, very briefly. So again, I would recommend for listeners, if they haven't heard these readings from the Gospel of Mark, to investigate chapter 5, and they can do so through the Gospel Year videos, and I'll put links in the description below this video. The poignancy and some of the context is given in Mark, and it's missing here in Matthew, and these do therefore really, they're told very sparsely. So here in Matthew, after the feasting, as it were, with Levi, namely Matthew, the tax collector who has become a disciple of Jesus, Jesus is approached by, it says here, a certain ruler, and in Mark we know this is Jairus, who was the ruler of one of the synagogues in Capernaum. My daughter is even now dead, but come and lay thy hand upon her, and she shall live. In Mark, the Jairus actually says, my daughter is on the point of death. So she's still living when Jairus had left the house to come and seek last-minute help from Jesus. And what we spoke about when we covered this story in the Gospel of Mark is the very clear human element of this story, that as the leader of one of the synagogues, Jairus is part of the religious elite and would have essentially scorned some of the healings and the sayings of Jesus, along with the scribes and Pharisees, and certainly would not have supported Jesus providing healing on the Sabbath, for example. But now tragedy has struck him in his home with his daughter, who we know from other Gospels is 12 years old, is on the point of death. Maybe that's from a terrible fever or some other malady. And there is nothing like the severe illness of a child to wring out a parent's heart, and the parent will do anything to save that child. And here Jairus has no qualms whatsoever than to rush from the home, find Jesus. He's probably learned that he's returned back across the Sea of Galilee and that he's perhaps in a slightly less wholesome area of the city, feasting with tax collectors, but Jairus has no bother with that whatsoever, rushes to find him and worships him, probably on his knees before Jesus, a plea for help. And Jesus immediately tries to help him. In Mark, we learn that straightway Jesus responds to this plea. And he's followed by his disciples. In Mark, we learn there's a multitude around them. Now, there's this beautiful sort of intermezzo healing event en route to the house of Jairus. There's a woman in the multitude. She probably was close by to Jesus when he was in Levi's house, not sure how to have contact with him. She has borne a plague, essentially, for 12 years, which means that she has a constant issue of blood. It sounds like it might be some tumour that's not healing, something like that, and it may be something related to menstrual bleeding. In Mark, we learn that she'd spent every last penny she had trying to seek a cure, but the doctors had only made her worse. So she's probably at this point poverty-stricken and desperate. But she is a woman of profound faith, and she believes with all of her heart, if she can but touch the garment of Jesus, she will be healed. Now this scene is far more poignant in Mark because we learn that there's a multitude around Jesus, and then this woman touches his garment, but Jesus stops and says to his disciples, "Who touched me?" And the disciples essentially say, "What do you mean, who touched you? You're being mobbed by all these people." But Jesus, as Mark said, had felt the virtue leave him. This remarkable description from the Gospel of Mark, and sadly missing here in Matthew. So Jesus knew that something holy had happened, and he turned about, and the woman, trembling with fear, as we learn in Mark, came before him and explained to him that she had this disease and knew that if she could but touch his clothes, she would be healed. And then the two Gospels are very much in accord here with the response of Jesus, which is one of great compassion and love. And here in Matthew, Jesus even uses the term daughter when he speaks to her, which is extremely rare in the Gospels. So it's very, very loving. Daughter, be of good comfort. Don't tremble with fear. Don't be afraid. You're healed because of your faith. And the woman was made whole from that hour. And here again we have another example of the critical requirement of faith for healing through Jesus Christ. And we see the same thing here with Jairus. Now in Mark, when they near the house, friends come to Jairus and say, "Don't bother the master any longer, your daughter is now dead." So the daughter died when Jesus and Jairus were en route to the house. So both Gospels now are very much in accord. Jesus, in the Gospel of Mark, simply says to Jairus, "Have faith." And Jairus says, "I believe, I believe, I believe." They come into the house, and there are the minstrels and people making a noise, namely the ceremonial wailing and music playing that would be the first stage of mourning the death of a loved one. And Jesus basically with the help of Jairus, empties the house. Give place, the maid is not dead, but is just asleep. And they laughed him to scorn, a bitter laughter, a laughter of thinking this man is out of his mind, essentially. But Jairus puts them out of the house. And we learn in Mark that only the 3 disciples, Peter, James and John, are allowed to come into the chamber with Jesus, and also the 2 parents, Jairus and his wife. And it's just those present. Jesus takes the young girl by the hand, and in the Gospel of Mark he says Talitha cumai, which is, damsel, I say unto thee, arise, and she arises. And in Mark we have this lovely language about those present. They were astonished with a great astonishment. So I'm giving all of this extra context from Mark because it really brings these 2 healing stories very much alive, and I'm not quite sure why they're so briefly described in Matthew. It may be that Matthew felt it wasn't necessary to go into such detail simply because the Gospel of Mark existed and Matthew didn't want to be repetitious. That could be the reason. Now, in the Gospel of Mark, as is so often the case, Jesus, when he's provided a great healing event, instructs those that he's healed not to publicize the matter. And in Mark we learn that he commands them that no man should know of this resurrection. And again, we suppose that this is because such miracles are so extraordinary, they would lead to a radical shift in the nature of the ministry, where Jesus would essentially be forced onto some kind of throne by the multitude, and that's not his destiny. He does not and is not the king, so to speak. He is the Son of God. And in Matthew it just ends more simply that of course word would get around about this healing, because the people that were obviously turned out of the house, who had seen the dead girl and who were mourning and wailing, to see that girl standing on her own 2 feet, eating a meal, because Jesus in Mark also commands that the girl be given something to eat, which is a very practical suggestion for someone who's come through a very, very terrible fever. They obviously, this would be something that would spread like wildfire amongst people in Capernaum. So very poignant healings of the woman in the crowd and the daughter of Jairus, the ruler of the synagogue. And particularly that resurrection healing, absolutely extraordinary. And in the equivalent reading from Mark, which would have been in mid-January, I spoke there about what would be the scientific aspects of this in modern science. The first reaction would be this is all foolishness. You can't bring someone back from the dead. But of course we do this in hospitals all the time, using electric shocks to the heart, for example, or there are ways to keep people on life support all through modern technology. And some people who have been on life support for a very long time do actually come back to almost normal brain activity again. So it's not that clear-cut from a purely objective modern medical point of view. I had a much more, I would say, metaphysical discussion of this in that gospel, surrounding the nature of faith, the nature of privacy, why Jesus would only allow a very handful of people in the room. Many of his healings are very, very public, but this one was very, very private. And I talked about the need both for faith and for sensitivity, namely to reduce the perturbation of the environment around the girl. And that latter part very much is a theme in quantum physics. The role of the environment being able to perturb what in quantum mechanics we call pure states. And this led Schrödinger, one of the co-discoverers or co-inventors of quantum mechanics, to talk about a paradox involving Schrödinger's cat, a cat that can be alive and dead at the same time, and is either alive or dead depending on how it's measured, how the environment interacts with it. So this is not the stuff of fancy. This is a very real conversation in the interpretation of quantum mechanics that to this day is not properly resolved. Now, quantum physicists quite rightly would tisk me for bringing this up here, because they would say that there's too much noise, there's too much environment in this healing story to be relevant. But I'm just putting it there for now and allowing that to at least be a theme for us to try to make the sometimes tenuous connections to science, given that there are beautiful mysteries in the Gospels and there are beautiful mysteries in science, and who's not to say that some of these are shared between the two.